I'm not the type of person who goes through her husband's things. In all my years with Mark, I'd always believed some lines are better left uncrossed. His briefcase was on the sofa, in its usual spot, just like any other day. Nothing was different. There were no warning signs telling me to stop. But that day, I didn't look away. I walked over, unzipped his briefcase, and looked inside. Everything was neat, as always, until my hand brushed against a small pocket on the inside. I pulled it out. It only took a second for me to realize what it was. And it only took another second to know it had no place in our marriage. Didn't cry. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, holding it for longer than I should have, as if letting go would make it all the more real. 3 hours later, when the house was silent, my phone rang. An unknown number, I answered. The person on the other end of the line said that Mark was in the hospital. Their voice was so calm, but their last sentence made everything else fade away. He wasn't alone. My name is Chloe Sterling. I was 32 years old, living in a quiet suburb, in a house that, from the outside, looked like everything was exactly as it should be. Before I got married, I was an architect. The work was demanding, but I loved the feeling of standing on an unfinished construction site, watching something transform from a blueprint into a real building. I was used to making my own decisions, used to a fast-paced life, and used to the feeling of moving forward every single day. After marrying Mark, I stopped. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed it was the logical choice. As Mark said, he needed someone to keep things stable on the home front so he could focus on growing his career. I heard that line so many times it eventually became reason enough to convince myself that quitting was necessary. The house we lived in was in a quiet, manicured subdivision. It was a large, multi-level home with a bright facade, and everything was always kept so tidy there was hardly any room for mess. My husband's family was well off. The family business had been around for generations, and everything in the house followed a clear, unspoken order. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone understood the do's and don'ts. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, was the one who maintained that order. She never had to raise her voice or show her displeasure openly. A single glance or a softly spoken sentence was enough to make anyone correct themselves. To outsiders, she was the perfect woman, someone who knew how to keep her family looking admirable at all times. After living in that house for a while, I realized one thing. Here, everything had to be right. Not right according to your feelings, but right according to the image this family wanted to maintain. Mark was still the man everyone considered reliable. He was calm, a man of few words, always keeping a perfect distance from everything. On the outside, that was a strength. Inside the house, it sometimes made things far too quiet. We still had dinner together. We still sat in the same seats, with the same kind of food. I'd still ask about his work, and he'd still answer briefly that everything was fine. There were no fights, no conflicts, nothing big enough to be called a problem. But there was also nothing deep enough to be called a connection. Mark's younger brother, Ryan, lived with us along with his wife, Maya. They were younger, more talkative, and sometimes made the house feel a little more lively. But it was all on the surface, like a thin veneer over a space that was, at its core, deeply silent. I couldn't say I was unhappy. Everything was stable, everything was correct, everything fit within the framework everyone else wanted. It's just that as time went on, I started to feel something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't outright loneliness. It was like standing in a brightly lit room that had no warmth. Everything kept going. Life moved on. But there was a part of me that was slowly becoming a stranger. And the most terrifying part was that no one in this house saw that as a problem. Nothing was wrong, but nothing felt real anymore either. Things didn't change overnight. If someone were to ask when exactly it all started, I wouldn't know what to say. Because there wasn't one specific moment to mark it. There wasn't a single event big enough to make you stop and think that something was happening. It was just a series of very small changes. so small that if you weren't paying attention, you'd convince yourself that everything was still normal. Mark started talking less. He was never a big talker, but there used to be times when we could sit a little longer after dinner, talk about simple things, or just ask each other pointless questions. But lately, all our conversations ended much more quickly. I'd ask a question, he'd answer. I'd stop, and he'd stop too. It was nothing. At first, I thought it was just about work. The pressure, the tight schedules, the long meetings. I told myself not to overthink things that might not even be there. But then, I started to notice his phone. Before, Mark would leave his phone anywhere. On the dining table, in the living room. Sometimes he'd even forget it on the sofa. But lately, it was almost always in his hand, or placed somewhere he could grab it the second he turned around. At dinner, he'd place his phone face down on the table. Then a notification came in. He'd glance at it so quickly, then immediately turn the screen off. One time, as I was walking past, his screen had just lit up. I only caught a glimpse of a short message, with no name attached, just a symbol and a few numbers. I couldn't make out the words, but it looked like an appointment reminder. Before I could finish reading it, Mark had already picked up the phone. The way he did it was so natural, quick, smooth, nothing out of the ordinary. But it was that very naturalness that made me pause for a moment, not because he did something wrong, but because it looked like a habit he'd had for a long time. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I didn't want to turn something uncertain into a conversation we could never take back. There are some questions that, once you ask them, there's no way to go back to how things were. Besides the messages, there were also the nights he came home later than usual. The excuse was always the same, meeting a client. Mark's job did require meetings like that, so at first I didn't think anything was strange. But as time went on, it started happening more and more often. There were days he wouldn't come home for dinner. There were days he'd come home so late, after everyone in the house had already gone to bed. And there were also days he'd come home early, but only to change his clothes and then leave again. I started to realize I was observing him more often. It wasn't on purpose. It was more like a natural reflex I couldn't control. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, I stopped at one of his shirts. On the collar, there was a very faint scent. It wasn't strong or obvious, but it definitely wasn't the cologne he usually wore. It was a softer scent, warmer, and completely unfamiliar. I held onto that shirt longer than usual, not to look for proof, but to make sure I wasn't mistaken. After that, I folded it, put it in the closet, and told myself it was probably just a smell from somewhere he'd been. An enclosed room, another person, any kind of meeting. A simple explanation, enough to let me go on living as if nothing was wrong. But from that day on, I never saw things the same way again. Another night, while we were having a family dinner, Mark's phone vibrated softly on the table. He glanced down, just for a second, then went back to eating like nothing happened. I asked if he needed to take the call. He shook his head, said it wasn't important. But a few minutes later, he stood up, said he had to call someone back, and walked out onto the balcony. I couldn't hear the conversation. I could only see his back facing the house, his shoulders slightly hunched, and his voice was lower than usual. A voice I recognized, but it felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. I stood in the kitchen doorway, my hands still wet, just looking at him, not to eavesdrop, but because I felt like I was standing on the outside of what used to be my entire world. There are some changes that are so hard to explain. There's no clear evidence, no confession, not one big thing that makes you just stop everything. Just small, separate details that, when you put them all together, create a feeling that is perfectly clear. It's like when you walk into a familiar room, everything is still in the same place, but you know for sure that something has changed. You can't point to exactly what it is, but you can't pretend you don't feel it. I don't know what's really happening yet, but I'm starting to figure it out. That afternoon passed just like any other. Sunlight was still streaming through the kitchen window, reflecting off the light-colored stone countertop. The sound of the TV in the living room was a low hum, so familiar it felt like part of the room's itself. Daniel came home earlier than usual. He came inside, dropped his bag on the sofa, and said he had a client meeting tonight, so he was just stopping by to change and then leave again. His voice was flat, with the same even rhythm as always. Nothing was different. But I didn't turn away immediately like I normally would. The bag was just lying there, in its usual spot, zipper still closed, with one corner leaning slightly forward, a small detail I'd never noticed before. I stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at it for a little longer than usual. It wasn't because I was sure of anything. It was because I was no longer sure of my own feelings. I dried my hands and walked into the living room. Step by step, slower than usual, for no clear reason, just a vague feeling that if I did this, something could never go back to the way it was. I stopped in front of Daniel's bag. The house was still just as quiet. I unzipped it. The sound was so soft, but in that moment I could hear it more clearly than anything else. Inside, there was nothing strange. His laptop, documents, a notebook, all neatly arranged, just like Daniel always kept things. I was about to close it again, until my hand brushed against a small pocket on the inside. The pocket wasn't completely closed, just slightly open. I pulled it open slowly. There was a small object in the corner, hidden among other little things. I took it out. It only took a second for me to understand what it was. And it only took another second to realize it had no place in this marriage. Not because we never had intimate moments like other married couples, but because I knew perfectly well that even if we did, that thing would never be here. Inside a bag I was never supposed to touch, inside a space that no longer belonged to me. I just stood there frozen. There were no tears, no dramatic reaction. There was just an emptiness that came so quickly, so coldly, spreading from within, making all my thoughts seem to grind to a halt. I stared at the thing in my hand, not to be sure of it again, but to give myself enough time to accept that I wasn't mistaken. From upstairs, the sound of the shower started. That perfectly normal sound was exactly what made this moment feel so alien. Everything in this house was still carrying on as usual. But inside my head, something had just stopped. I put the object back where I found it, very slowly, very precisely. I zipped it shut, returning the bag to its original position, as if no one had ever touched it. Then I stood up straight again. I realized my hands were so cold they were almost numb. I went back to the kitchen. I continued with the work I'd left unfinished. The knife met the cutting board, the sound rhythmic and steady, as if everything was still proceeding as it should. But I knew with absolute clarity. From that moment on, I was no longer in the same marriage. I didn't do anything. No rash moves, no phone calls, no prying questions, no sign that I had just seen anything at all. Daniel was still upstairs, the sound of the shower still running, and this house was still the same as it had always been. Only one thing had changed. Me. I stood in the kitchen, looking at what I was doing, but I no longer felt like a part of it all. I still went through the motions, chopping vegetables, setting the table, preparing dinner, but it all felt like it was being done by another version of me. A calmer version, and a colder one. I realized I no longer wanted to react right then and there. It wasn't because I was stronger, but because I understood that if I reacted based on emotion right now, I would only see a tiny fraction of the truth. There are some things that, if you rush them, you only see what other people want you to see. I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to understand. Dinner that evening went on as usual. His mother, Susan, sat in her usual spot, talking about family matters. Rick was talking about his work, and Maya smiled faintly, chiming in with a few words at just the right moments. Daniel was sitting there too, across from me, eating slowly, answering when spoken to. Nothing was different. If it weren't for what happened earlier, I wouldn't have noticed a thing. But now, everything felt different. It wasn't in the way they talked. It was in the way I saw them. I started noticing details I had missed before. The way Maya's eyes flickered toward Daniel when he spoke. It wasn't long. It wasn't obvious, but there was an intimacy there I'd never recognized before. The way Daniel didn't look me directly in the eye when I asked a simple question. It wasn't an overt avoidance, just a slight shift, enough that you wouldn't notice if you weren't really paying attention. The pauses in the conversation. Those moments when no one was speaking, yet the atmosphere wasn't awkward, as if everyone had long grown accustomed to that silence. I didn't participate much in the conversations like I usually did, not because I didn't want to, but because I was listening more, observing more. There were things I hadn't seen before, not because they weren't there, but because I never thought I needed to look for them. After dinner, Daniel said he had to go out. His voice sounded normal. No rush in his tone, no lengthy explanation. Just a brief announcement, the same as always. I nodded. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't ask when he'd be back. He looked at me for a moment, as if waiting for a specific reaction. But I didn't give him the one he was expecting. I just said I would finish cleaning up and then go upstairs. He left. The door closed softly, a familiar sound, but this time I heard it more clearly. The house fell silent again. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring into the empty space in front of me. Not to think about what I should do next, but to accept that something had changed and there was no going back. I no longer trusted what I saw every day. And when that trust is gone, all that's left is data. I started to observe, not as a wife, but as someone trying to piece together a story I had only seen a fraction of. I didn't want to react. I wanted to understand. That night felt like it arrived slower than usual. Not because time was moving differently, but because I realized I was paying attention to every small moment in this house. The clinking of plates, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the creak of a door opening and closing. Things I hadn't noticed before now felt clearer than ever. After dinner, everyone went back to their rooms, a familiar routine. Helen turned off the TV, Michael went upstairs, and Maya followed behind him, still wearing that faint smile I was so used to seeing. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer, cleaning up more slowly than usual. Not because I was busy, but because I wasn't ready to go upstairs yet. The house grew quieter. The silence I once found comforting, but now it felt like an endless, stretching void. I washed my hands, dried them, and then stood leaning against the kitchen counter. My phone was lying there. The screen was dark, no notifications, nothing unusual. I don't know how long I stood there like that. It wasn't until my phone vibrated that I realized I'd been waiting for something, even though I didn't know what it was. An unknown number. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. "Hello, am I speaking with Olivia Miller?" The voice on the other end was very calm, professional, with no sense of urgency. I confirmed it was me. They said they were calling from a hospital. Then they said Mark's name. In an instant, every thought in my head stopped, not because I was surprised, but because I'd had a feeling that sooner or later, something was going to happen. I just never thought it would come like this. The person on the phone explained that Mark had just been brought to the hospital after a minor incident. Nothing life-threatening, but they needed a family member to come and handle some paperwork. Their voice remained flat, maintaining a professional distance, but I couldn't really hear the rest of the explanation clearly. I only asked one thing. Is he there alone? There was a very brief pause. It wasn't long, but it was long enough for me to understand that the answer wasn't simple. Apparently, when Daniel was brought to the hospital, he wasn't alone. They didn't say specifically who it was, just that there was a woman with him. I didn't ask any more questions. It wasn't because I didn't want to know. It was because I knew that if I asked, I'd get an answer I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. I hung up the phone. The kitchen was exactly the same as I'd left it. The light was still on, the counter was still clean, everything was still in its place. But in my head, everything was already starting to shift. I went upstairs, grabbed a jacket, and snatched the car keys. No one in the house asked where I was going. No one stopped me. It was as if me leaving the house this late at night was a completely normal thing to do. On the drive to the hospital, the city was as busy as ever. Headlights, the sound of horns, the endless stream of people moving. Everything out there was following its own rhythm. I was the only one who had fallen out of that rhythm. I wasn't thinking about what I would say when I saw Daniel. I wasn't thinking about how I would react. There was only one thing repeating over and over in my head. Who was that woman? And for some reason, even before seeing her, I had this very clear gut feeling, a feeling I didn't want to believe. I just never expected that person to be. At that hour, the hospital wasn't noisy, but you couldn't call it quiet either. The white fluorescent lights stretched down the corridors. Everything was clean, orderly, and felt too cold for a place that was supposed to be filled with so much emotion. I parked the car, walked inside, and gave Daniel's name at the front desk. The clerk looked at their screen, confirmed his name, and pointed down the hall. I started walking in that direction, step by step, not too fast but not slow either. My mind wasn't racing anymore. There was just this distinct feeling that I was walking toward something I had already suspected, but wasn't ready to face. As I rounded the corner, I saw him. Daniel was sitting on one of those long waiting room benches, hands on his knees, hunched over slightly. He didn't look seriously hurt. There were no signs of panic, just like someone who was waiting. And next to him was someone else. I didn't stop immediately. I took a few more steps, just close enough to see her face clearly. Maya. She was sitting perfectly upright, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her hair still perfectly in place. She looked nothing like someone who had just been in an incident. She was just there, next to Daniel, in a place where she had no business being, especially not like this. For one brief moment, everything went completely silent. It wasn't the normal quiet of a hospital. This was the kind of silence that descends when you see something so clearly that there's nothing left to deny. David lifted his head when he realized someone was approaching. His eyes met mine, paused for a moment, and then shifted. Not panic, not surprise, but something else, like he was trying to figure out what to say first. Maya turned to look, too. The gentle smile I was used to seeing at home was gone, but she didn't look nervous, either, just silent. I stood there in front of them, not asking any questions, not saying a word. Not a single word was spoken. The space between the three of us wasn't large, but the feeling in it was immense. It was as if each of us was standing on a different side of the same story. The nurse walked by, asked David a few brief questions, and checked on him. He answered normally, his voice even, as if this was just an unlucky night, as if there was nothing that needed explaining. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking, not cold like they were before, just empty, a profoundly real kind of emptiness. The elevator doors opened behind me. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was, Ryan. He was walking faster than usual, then stopped short when he saw the three of us standing there. His gaze shifted from me to David, and then to Maya. No one spoke. No questions were asked. Not a single explanation was offered, just the looks in our eyes. And in those looks, everything was perfectly clear. Ryan slowly clenched his fists, then let them go. He didn't approach Maya. He didn't ask her anything, either. He just stood there, keeping his distance, as if one more step forward would shatter everything into pieces that could never be put back together. No one raised their voice. There was no confrontation, no scene, but the atmosphere in that hallway, it was broken. It had cracked, so very slowly, but it would never be the same again. I looked at David one last time in that moment, not searching for an answer, just to make sure that what I'd seen was real. And then I turned around, without a word, without waiting. There was no reason to stay any longer. As I walked out of that hallway, one thing became painfully clear. I thought what I found in that bag was everything, but I was wrong. I left the hospital just as the city lights were beginning to flicker on. The city was still bustling, still noisy. The stream of traffic seemed endless. Nothing out there had changed, except I was no longer the same person standing in it. I didn't go straight home. I pulled into the nearest parking lot, killed the engine, and just sat there in the silence. Not to calm down, but to make room for everything that was now replaying in my head. With nothing to distract me, the images started flooding back, not in any particular order. Instead, they were just random fragments, connecting in a way I'd never seen before. Mia. I remembered all those nights at the house, how she always seemed to sit just a little closer to David than to me. Not too close, nothing obvious, but always at a distance that seemed perfectly innocent. I remembered the way she'd hand David a glass of water, the way their fingers would brush for just a second before quickly pulling away. It was a tiny gesture, not enough for anyone else to notice, but it happened over and over again until it just became normal. I remembered their conversations. They were never long or deeply personal, but there was always an undercurrent I could never quite break into. The words themselves were simple, but the looks that went with them, they were anything but. Once I was walking past the living room and saw Mia standing behind David, leaning over his shoulder to look at something on his phone. They were standing so close, I saw it. But I just kept walking. It wasn't because I didn't notice, it was because I didn't feel the need to question it. Now I understand. It wasn't that I didn't see it. I had chosen not to ask. I remembered the way Mia would laugh when David said something that went right over my head. I remembered those fleeting moments when their eyes would meet for just a fraction of a second too long. Nothing was ever obvious. There was never one single thing big enough to make an outsider suspicious. But when you piece all those little details together, they're no longer just random moments. They become a story that had begun long before I ever knew I was in it. I sat in the car, staring out the window, but what I was really seeing was everything that had been happening inside my own home. There was no specific day you could point to as the beginning. No single moment that you could call the turning point. There were just so many little things happening for so long, so routinely, that they eventually became something undeniable. I used to think betrayal was a single decision. One moment, a clear choice between right and wrong. But now I understand that's not how it happens at all. It all's with the little things a person allows themselves, from the boundaries that are loosened little by little. From the moments of not getting caught, until slowly, there's no longer a feeling that what's being done is wrong. And by the time you realize it, everything has already gone too far to turn back. I don't know exactly when it all began. But I know one thing. I might have been a part of this story for a long time. I came home later than usual. Almost all the lights in the house were off. Only a dim glow remained in the living room, just enough to see the familiar outlines that have been my companions for years. No one asked where I had been. No one was waiting for me. Everything was back to normal, as if that night at the hospital had never happened. I went straight up to the bedroom. I didn't turn on the light right away. I just stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The room was the same as always. Everything was neat, orderly, with no sign of anything having changed. But I knew some things don't leave a trace. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the work desk I used to rarely touch. David's laptop was there. Normally, I wouldn't open it. Not because I didn't have the right, but because I never wanted to invade a space that someone didn't want to share. But tonight, that boundary didn't mean anything anymore. I turned on his laptop. I wasn't looking for anything specific. It was just a feeling that there were things that, if I didn't see them now, I would never see them again. The screen lit up. Everything still looked completely normal. Work emails, documents, meeting schedules. Nothing seemed out of place on the surface. I wasn't in a hurry. I checked every item, every folder, slower than usual. It wasn't because I was looking for proof. It was because I was learning to see the things I'd never paid attention to before. A small folder with no obvious name sat in the corner, inconspicuous, no reason at all for anyone to be curious about it. I opened it. Inside were a few document files and a series of saved emails, short conversations focused on work. But there was one thing that made me stop. The sender's name, Nadia Cole. I knew that name, a colleague of David's. I'd heard David mention her a few times, in casual stories about work. Nothing special. There was no reason to remember it. But this time, I wasn't reading them like I used to. I read them slowly. Not just the content, but the way they wrote. The unnecessary questions. Replies that came back faster than usual. Conversations that weren't strictly about work, but were saved anyway. Nothing was too obvious. Not a single sentence crossed a line or could be considered wrong. But there was a different rhythm. A rhythm I had started to notice before. I opened another file, a calendar. There were the client meetings I'd heard David mention. The times were familiar. The days he came home late. Nicole's name was there, not for all of them, but on enough of them to form a pattern I couldn't ignore. I sat there in silence. There was no emotional outburst. Not the same shock I felt at the hospital. Just clarity, a chillingly cold clarity. I thought what I saw at the hospital was the whole story. I was wrong. That was only part of it, and the other part was so much quieter. Not one life, but two. Two parallel systems, kept separate for so long that they would never collide. One life inside our home, one life outside of it. And all this time, I had only ever been part of half the story. I shut the laptop screen. The room went dark again. Physically, nothing had changed. But everything inside of me had shifted once more, and I understood one thing. What I had just seen still wasn't the worst of it. I didn't shut the laptop right away. My hand was still on the keyboard, but I didn't open another file. Not because I'd had enough, but because I needed a moment to process what was forming in my mind. Those client meetings, those anonymous messages, Maya, Natalie. These weren't just separate pieces anymore. Everything was starting to connect in a way I never could have imagined. I turned my laptop back on, not to look for Natalie again. I was looking for something else. Something I once knew so well. Financial documents, internal reports, spreadsheets whose initial structure I had helped design years ago. I had worked with David in the early days when the company was just starting to grow. It wasn't official, I didn't have a title, but I was there long enough to understand how everything was built from the ground up. I knew how the system worked, and I also knew if something was wrong, where it would leave a trail. I opened every file, slowly, not searching based on emotion, just logic. There were several expense items that appeared over and over with very generic descriptions. There were transactions, not large amounts, but broken down into smaller pieces, scattered across different times. If you looked at them one by one, nothing seemed strange. But when you put them all together, they formed a very clear pattern. A pattern I had once helped create. Except back then, that system was designed to optimize efficiency. But now, it was being used for something else. I stopped on one particular spreadsheet. A name appeared there. Not Maya, not Natalie, but an intermediary company whose name I'd never heard before. But the way the name was entered into the system, it felt so familiar. I stared at the screen for a very long time, not because I didn't understand, but because I understood all too well. This wasn't about feelings anymore. It wasn't about a man having an affair. This was a structure, a system that had been running for so long that it had become seamless, and I, for a very long time, had been standing right next to it without seeing the whole picture. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I had left the position that was once my entire world. I used to think I became weak when I quit my job. I thought I had lost the most important part of myself. But now, looking at these numbers, I realized something. What I knew, it was never gone. It was just set aside. I sat up straight. For the first time all night, I didn't feel empty anymore. Not because anything had gotten easier, but because I could finally see a path forward. It wasn't clear yet, but it was enough to take the next step. I wasn't weak. I had just been in the wrong place for too long. And maybe what I needed wasn't to go back to who I was, but to stand where I was always meant to be, once again. I shut the laptop. The room was plunged back into darkness. But this time, it didn't feel the same. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was the quiet before everything was about to change. For the first time in years, I remembered who I used to be. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sound of footsteps on the stairs, the smell of coffee from the kitchen, the light filtering through the windows. The world outside started its day, just like any other, only I was no longer moving to the same rhythm. I didn't bring up what happened last night. I didn't ask Mark when he got home. I didn't look at Chloe any differently. Didn't let my expression change. If anyone was watching from the outside, they would never know something was wrong. And that's exactly what I wanted. I didn't need them to know what I was thinking. I needed time, and I needed clarity. Breakfast went on just like any other day. Mark's mother, Eleanor, asked a few casual questions. Kevin answered. Chloe chimed in with a few words, her voice still soft, always at just the right moment. Mark sat across from me, eating slowly, glancing over occasionally, but never holding my gaze for long. I was still there, sitting in my spot, answering when necessary, quiet when I didn't need to be. Nothing was different, except for one thing. I was no longer reacting out of habit. Every sentence, every glance, every pause that hung in the air, I recorded it all, without judgment, just observing. After breakfast, I went back to my room, not to rest, but to begin. I opened the files from last night again. This time, it wasn't about confirming a feeling. It was about collecting the facts. I started keeping a private log, noting the recurring transactions, the overlapping timelines, the names that appeared more often than usual. I wasn't trying to find everything all at once. I was just gathering enough to see the pattern. And once you see the pattern, the rest just falls into place. For the next few days, I let everything carry on as normal. I didn't change my routine, didn't change the way I talked. I didn't create any ripples that might make anyone suspicious. David kept going out like he always did. Maya kept laughing like she always did. Everything went on exactly as it always had. There was just one difference. This time I could see it. I started connecting the dots. An appointment, an expense, a short text, a gap in his schedule. Things that once seemed random were now starting to link together. Not quickly, but clearly enough. I no longer felt that initial, sharp pain, not because the situation had gotten any better. It was because I was no longer positioning myself to be hurt. I had shifted to a different position. A vantage point where I could see the whole story without getting dragged down by every single detail. I didn't want to win. I didn't want to prove a point. I didn't want to make a big scene at the end of it all. I just wanted this to end the way it was supposed to. And to do that, I needed more than just emotion. I needed precision. I needed the right timing. And I had to make sure that when everything was finally revealed, there would be no room left for any kind of explanation. I didn't want to win. I wanted to finish this the right way. I didn't pick a special moment. Not in the middle of the night, not when we were alone in the house, and not when tensions were running high. I chose a perfectly ordinary evening. After dinner, when everyone else had left the table, David lingered for a moment, just like he always did. I'm not asking you to move. I'm just sitting here, across from you. The distance between us hasn't changed. It's just that this time, I'm no longer in the same position. Not physically, but in the way I'm looking at you. David looked at me, a little surprised that I didn't get up right away like I usually do. He didn't ask anything at first. He waited for me to speak first. Didn't start with a big question. I asked something very simple. Work has been a lot busier than usual lately, hasn't it? He nodded. His voice was completely normal, not a hint of defensiveness. I went on. Those client meetings, are they happening often? He said yes, that the market was changing, there were more business partners, so he had to meet them in person to maintain the relationships. A perfectly reasonable answer. I nodded. Didn't challenge him. I just asked one more question. Those meetings, where do they usually happen? He listed off a few of the usual places. A coffee shop, a restaurant, a private conference room. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I waited for him to finish talking. Then I said a single sentence, not in a raised voice, without changing my rhythm, just stating a piece of information. You didn't mention Nadia. The air between us went silent for a moment. Not for long, but it was long enough for me to see the look in his eyes change. It wasn't panic. It was a realization that this conversation had just taken a very different turn. He didn't answer right away. I didn't press him. I just looked at him, letting him know that I wasn't guessing. I knew. I continued. And you conveniently left out the expenses you've been breaking up into smaller charges for the past 3 months. His hands rested on the table, motionless. His expression was no longer as calm as it usually was. He remained silent. I added one more sentence. And I'm guessing you weren't planning on mentioning that Maya was at the hospital with you that night either. This time, he looked straight at me, no longer looking away, no longer keeping his distance, just staring, as if he was trying to figure out where to even begin. I didn't say anything else. I didn't draw any conclusions. I didn't ask for an explanation. I let the silence hang in the air, long enough for him to understand that everything was already out in the open, and that there was no way to squirm out of it. Mark let out a very soft sigh. It wasn't a sigh of exhaustion. It was one of resignation, like someone who has just realized they have no choice but to stop running. He didn't deny it, nor did he immediately try to explain. He just sat there in silence, as if he were replaying everything that had happened in his mind. I didn't need him to tell me everything. I didn't need him to admit to every single detail, because what I needed wasn't words. It was the truth, without the cover-ups, and in that moment I knew I had it. He didn't deny it. He simply had no other choice. It didn't all fall apart at once. There was no shouting, no single moment where everything shattered. It began the same way so many other things in life do, quietly. After that conversation, Mark didn't try to explain much. He became quieter, and most of the time, he avoided being in the same room with me for any longer than necessary. But that didn't matter anymore. What needed to be revealed was already out in the open. The rest was just a matter of time, and time, in its own way, always brings to light what people try to keep hidden. A few days later, the first signs began to appear. A phone call to the house one morning. It wasn't for me, it was for Mark. I didn't hear what was said, but I saw the way he stood there, frozen, after hanging up. Completely still, he had no reaction. He just stood there, as if trying to process what had just happened. That same day, he left the house earlier than usual, without saying where he was going. It wasn't necessary anymore. By late afternoon, word started spreading internally at the company. An investigation, not a routine audit, not a random one, an investigation with a clear target. The documents I had seen before, they weren't just sitting quietly in the system anymore. Those documents were being opened, cross-referenced, compared against each other, just like I had done. But this time, I wasn't the only one looking. Jessica's name started popping up in internal conversations. It was no longer just a name tucked away in the corner of a file, but part of a much bigger question. She didn't come to the house anymore. No one mentioned her name, but her absence was louder than any explanation. Mark started coming home later. Some days, he didn't come home at all, not because he was busy, but because he no longer had a place to come back to, not like before. Inside the house, everything began to change in a very subtle way. Carol grew quieter. The usual questions at the dinner table were gone. No more comments about how things should be maintained. She still sat there, in her usual spot, but the atmosphere around her was different. It wasn't about control anymore. It was a silence, and everyone understood why. Kevin still went to work every day, still came home on time, but he didn't linger in the living room anymore. No more small talk, no more laughter. Mia spent more time in her room. Her door was always closed. No one knocked. No one asked why. In that house, there wasn't a single big confrontation. No one raised their voice. No one openly demanded an explanation. But everything had shifted. It's like when you move the center of something, all the other pieces just shift on their own, in a way you can't control. The family was still there. The house was still standing. But the thing that held it all together, it was just gone. I didn't have to do anything else. I didn't have to say anything else. The truth, once it's out, does its own work. I didn't leave right away. There wasn't some dramatic morning where I packed my bags and stormed out of that house, like you see in the movies. I stayed a little longer. Not to wait for something to change, but to tie up the loose ends. I started going through my personal things, stuff I'd forgotten about for years. Old sketches, documents from a job I used to have, all the pieces of myself I had put aside. I called an old friend. I didn't explain much. I just said that I wanted to go back to work. She didn't ask why. She just said the company was looking for people, and I could start whenever I was ready. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. In the days that followed, I started going out more. Not to run away from that house, but to remember a feeling I used to have. The feeling of standing in the middle of an unfinished project, hearing the sounds of people working around me, watching something get built piece by piece. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I'd come home at night, walk down the same hallways, open my bedroom door just like always. Except this time, I no longer felt like I was a part of that place. There was no official goodbye, no real, final apology, no ending to the story that everyone understood in the same way. It's just that at a certain point you realize you don't need to stay any longer to understand anything else. I left on an ordinary morning. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. The door closed behind me, softly, just like it always did. Only one thing was different. This time, I wasn't coming back. The city was still the same. The streets were still busy. The flow of people kept moving. Everything just went on with its own rhythm. And I, for the first time in a long time, was no longer standing still. I used to think that holding a family together meant holding on to everything, until I finally understood some things, the tighter you hold on to them, the more you lose yourself. There are some stories that don't need a clear ending to be understood. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't about who was right and who was wrong, but whether you're still in the place you're supposed to be. Ava didn't leave because she lost. She left because she finally saw the whole truth. And once you see it that clearly, there's no need to argue anymore. You just have to choose. If you've ever been in a relationship where everything looked perfect on the outside, but on the inside, nothing was real anymore, you know exactly what that feels like. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Because sometimes, a story isn't just meant to be heard, it's a mirror to hold up to yourself.